and welcome to the Live Electric Now and the Live Electric Now podcast series, the first of a four-part series to cut through the noise and get to the heart of EVs. This show is brought to you by Rocky Mountain Power, who has been kind enough to give me a platform to talk about innovation and policy, openly and off the cuff, and sponsored by Give Communities, who's providing us with this wonderful facility. I'm your host, James Campbell, and Chris is behind the glass. How are you doing, Chris?
I am great. Thank you for asking.
Do you still have power?
Yeah, I got power the other day. It's been very nice to get some electricity.
Yeah, so we're here live in Salt Lake City, and we've been recovering from a pretty impressive storm that hit the neighborhood, hit the community. Actually, at one point it reached a Category 3 hurricane. So we were originally scheduled to have this podcast on last Friday, September 11th, but we had to move it to today, Tuesday. I don't know what the day is today, Tuesday the 15th. And so normally we're doing this podcast series on Friday, so our next podcast will be this coming Friday, September 18th. And then we'll have the one on the 25th, and then the last one will be October 2nd. We're culminating with the National Drive Electric Week. So please enjoy this first one and don't miss out on the other ones as well. So today's podcast, we really want to get to the question of, are EVs real? And what is the current state of EVs? To help dig and dive into that interesting question, I have some fantastic guests today. First joining me over here on my right is Dr. Debbie Sigmund, who has a PhD from MIT in biology. She was the co-founder of Breathe Utah, a air quality nonprofit advocacy group, and is currently a air quality consultant. Welcome, Debbie.
Thank you so much, James.
And then on my left, the curly-haired, COVID hair, David Eccles. So, little note about David this is the first time I've ever seen him with curly hair. So I enjoy his COVID hair. There's very few people who have good COVID hair. He has good COVID hair. But David is one of the leading experts in EV infrastructure. He's a managing partner at Avia Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Advisors. He also has worked with EVgo and has installed or worked on the installation of thousands of DC and Level 2 chargers across the country. Welcome, David.
Thanks. Short answer to the question: EVs are real. So short episode, I guess.
Yeah. So Debbie, how does one go from being a cancer researcher to an EV expert?
The beauty, the thrill of being a scientist is looking for the most interesting question, and then you take analysis and critical thinking and you apply it. Around 15 years ago, especially in Salt Lake Valley, urban air pollution was right in our faces, and I was working on biomedical research, but the health threat, the disgustingness of what we can accumulate here in this valley, it became a fascinating problem to investigate and solve, and a natural evolution of those questions comes to electric vehicles.
So David, how does one go from reading Plato at Dartmouth to being you've probably installed more or been a part of more EV infrastructure installations than anybody I know in the country, and probably you're up there in the world. So tell us your story.
Well, I think it's kind of a long and winding road, but I think, look, at Dartmouth, I was blessed to have a broad liberal arts education. I think that served me well, understanding both the technical and the kind of the humanistic or business or marketing aspects of some of these challenges, and that's that's how I got involved in renewable energy first, and then made the transition to basically solving the same problem with different tools on the electric vehicle side. I studied anthropology at Dartmouth and ultimately decided that I was more interested in trying to change our culture, contribute to changing our
Than
culture.
studying our culture.
Well, you have to study it to change it, but I think that
That would be physical anthropology.
cultural, yeah. But I realized I was interested ultimately in having a direct impact, and that's led me to this today. And, you know, as you mentioned, we've worked on thousands of EV charging locations across over 30 states at this point.
So here's a question both of you. Can EV save the world?
There's a lot to say. That's a complex problem.
Save the world.
But you gotta say the cheerleader first.
You know, the question I've been finding myself asking while being both locked inside and overly introspective, and then reading more than ever, and hoping there's an idea boom that comes out of COVID. You know, here's the question: can we build ourselves out of being a blight on this planet? And then the answer is, what can we do but try? So we have to try, and electric vehicles keep coming up as a better answer than other things that we can build to solve our current way of doing things.
Yeah, I was reading a study by the University of California at Davis, one of the leading institutions in EVs, and they did an analysis that basically showed through the combination of the development of connected, autonomous, and shared and electric vehicles that we actually can comply with the Paris Accords, and that we can achieve that just through the electrification of transportation alone. And with the transportation sector, you know, surpassing the electric sector as the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, it's a fascinating premise.
Yeah, I think that reminds me of a favorite phrase of our friend Regan at USU, that, you know, it's a system of systems problem, and, you know, the transportation sector is one system. Electrification of vehicles is a subset of that system. So, in and of itself, is it the one thing? You know, it's a very complex problem to save the world, right? But I think that vehicle electrification and electrification broadly, including buildings and a lot of other parts of the built environment, are that is a critical piece of, you know, protecting ourselves from the long-term effects of climate change. Will it be enough? Yeah, will it be enough? Is it sufficient in and of itself? Time will tell, right? But I don't think it's sufficient in and of itself, but I do think it's a critical piece of that puzzle. And it ties into a lot of other improvements and efforts that a lot of smart and dedicated people are making in other sectors, like the power grid and elsewhere.
So Debbie, tell us about the argument. I've heard this before, that, you know, EVs are actually coal cars. They're dirty because what's supplying the power behind it. But talk about the life cycle of an electric vehicle, and is it clean or is it dirty?
Well, a biologist never picks at either one. Now, as to a coal car, well, the power that goes into charging your electric vehicle does depend on the source of the energy, and that's complicated in and of itself. But I don't know that there exists any utility that is 100% coal right now, so that would be pretty much impossible. Now, we should, let's see, so in terms of the life cycle, the full cycle of an electric vehicle, we have the production of the components, the assembly of the components, and then the driving of it using the energy from however it's sourced, and then its ultimate fate. And you'd have to say the same thing about a gasoline vehicle and its fuel supply. So I suppose the two parts that of an electric vehicle that raise the eyebrows right now the most are production of the battery and the materials that go into it, and I hope that we have time to get into that during our time together today. And the other is where the energy comes from to charge it, and then once it's in motion, we have to look at how efficient the electric motor is versus an internal combustion engine. In fact, if we start with there's nothing more efficient in terms of taking energy and turning it into motion than an electric motor. But my figure is about 3/4 of the energy from charging goes into is translated into motion.
Yeah, so EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, did an analysis, and they looked at for a electric vehicle like a Chevy Bolt that has an equivalent mileage of 122 miles per equivalent. They compared that to an internal combustion engine vehicle that got 35 miles per gallon. And they studied that over a year, which the average driver is 12,000 miles in a year. It takes about 12 million BTUs for that electric vehicle, but it takes over 40 million BTUs for that internal combustion. So it's about 3.5 times.
Yeah, that's about where I understand it, the range to be. By slightly different figures from different places. But the point being that the waste heat, the waste sound, and all of those mitigating parts in an internal combustion engine, powering all of the components, whatnot, that a lot of energy is lost in just the inherent technology. The advantages, we won't talk about the advantages, I think it's just a matter of habit really. Say an electric vehicle is so efficient that it takes energy from however it's produced and turns it into its intended goal of moving something from one spot to another with an overall less consumption. And then even if you look at the manufacturing of the components, you incorporate that into their entire life cycle, it's still advantage electric.
And two other factors to consider, of course, are that electric vehicles are in a unique position because they can get cleaner over time. A vehicle you buy today, or even if you bought a used EV today, 2 or 3 years from now, as the electric grid continues to improve in efficiency and renewable, percentage of renewable electricity generation, EVs will be, an EV that's purchased today could actually be more efficient in the future than it is today, which is completely the opposite of conventional vehicles. And on top of that, you've got the impact of regenerative braking and harvesting some of that kinetic energy that normally, conventional brakes just dissipate that energy as waste heat and brake dust. And electric vehicles can harvest that and reuse it. I know from driving my Leaf to Alta, if I left my house full, it might say 30% remaining on the battery. This is of 2015, so it only had 84 miles of range. But it might say 30% on the battery when I got to the top of the mountain. By the time I got back to the house, it would say 70% again.
Yeah, and addressing the cleaner and the cleaning of the grid. So right now, Rocky Mountain Power, our resource mix, we're roughly in that 60% coal, about 20 or so percent renewables, about 20% or so natural gas. But we're actually in the process of building an exorbitant amount of renewables right now. These are projects that are underway that within the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to be adding on about 5,000 megawatts of renewables. That's the equivalent of over 1 million homes of service. So we'll be able to supply just on this new build about the amount of homes that our customers will
impact locally, and that's the trend globally.
Yeah, and every utility across the country is making claims that by such and such date we're going to be we're going to be zero emitting, and I know we're going through that process. We do have a large fleet of coal plants, a lot of them in Wyoming, and we're in that process of transitioning off. You can't just turn the whole shut them all down all at once, because that would actually disrupt and actually could cause a lot of major problems. So instead, we're trying to do it in a logical, methodical, and efficient way to begin that transition. And that transition is beginning today.
As we push more renewables into it, and we'll turn off the fossil generation maybe a little faster. Thank you very much.
Well, yeah.
I gotta earn my credit here.
But I will say this. This summer, about 2 weeks ago in particular, you had 100-degree temperatures here in Salt Lake City. When you had 100-degree temperatures in Los Angeles, and San Francisco, Seattle, Las Vegas, Phoenix, the whole Western United States, whole grid had extreme temperatures, and we were really lucky in Utah that we actually had those fossils. I mean, that's one of until we bring on more.
We haven't said base load yet this episode,
Yeah,
have we?
Yeah. So anyway, so we did we did a good job, but we are in this.
Grid batteries will be another podcast. Make it number 5.
Yeah. So it's interesting. We did a focus group as part of our West Smart EV project. We talked to consumers and we asked them. It was fascinating to watch everyday people just talk about things versus just talking to people you already know who talk about the same things that you know. And one of the things that came up about, especially going back to where we are at the state of EVs, what they talked about, what was the barriers for them to adopt an EV, and it really came down to 3 things. There was the cost, that was a big barrier. There was the range anxiety and the ease, the infrastructure, and then the last one was the kind of the consumer preferences is going to be their lifestyle thing. So let's dive into that first issue of the cost. Dave, why do EVs? Why do their upfront costs? Why is it expensive?
Why is it expensive? Well, I mean, fundamentally, batteries are expensive still. They've come down a lot. I mean, basically what's happened with batteries over the last 10 years is akin to what happened with solar panels, 10 years before, where they went from being something that was a fairly expensive science project to something that penciled on an investment, basis, kind of regardless of what your personal opinions were, it just made financial sense. And they're getting to that point. A good benchmark, I think, for that is to look at a car that's been on the market for a while. Like, for example, the Nissan Leaf. I bought a Nissan Leaf in 2015. The same car, basically for the same price, was available, 3 years later for 125 miles of range, and now you can get one with 225 or 230 miles of range. And basically the price of the car hasn't changed. The range has changed radically. So far what's happened with EV battery prices is that the gains on battery pricing at volume production and optimized energy density, etc., most of those gains the car manufacturers have put towards improved range and performance. And I think that we're kind of approaching a point where, for most folks, I think 300 miles is a very reasonable range for a vehicle. I mean, if you go back to before, it's gasoline vehicles from before the energy crisis, when legislation basically forced efficiency, that was a pretty standard range. The only reason we have more now is that the gas tanks are the same size as they were before the crisis, and then they improved the efficiency. So that's how you got there. But so I think what we're going to see is as vehicles kind of hit 300 miles, longer range will maybe be an option, but that you'll start to see vehicle price start to come down. And that hasn't really happened yet. But that's something we're looking at the next year or two.
Okay, so if we're going to do a little quick deep dive into batteries. So here's one of the joys of your career kind of cycling back. I studied material science and then didn't really see it at all for 20 years, and so now it's kind of fun to come back. So a lithium-ion battery, what it is, how it works is you have an anode on one side, you have a cathode on the other, you have an electrolyte in the middle. So the anode, which is primarily made out of graphite, is used to basically get the lithium there. It's stored when you have a full charge, it's stored right there, and then when it's time to discharge or to move it, it pulls off an electron off of that positively charged ion. The lithium then goes through the electrolyte to the other side, to the cathode, and then it gets stored in the cathode. And usually how you measure the energy density in that cathode is how much lithium can you pack into there. And so that's kind of the generalized how a battery works. What makes batteries unique and the different types of batteries and the different costs are what are those materials made out of. And so in the cathode, so as I said, there's the two parts, the anode, which is primarily right now made out of graphite, and then the cathode, right now there's about, I would say, three main material types. You have what they call NMC, which is the nickel, manganese, and cobalt, which is primarily the LG chemistry, which is a lot of it. You have the NCA, nickel, cobalt, aluminum, which is primarily Tesla. And then you have also the LFP, or the lithium iron phosphate, which is, that's the, so Debbie, what else did I miss in there? Is there anything else that you would add in some of those, and what would make the,
those are the three that I.
what makes it expensive? What makes those batteries expensive?
That cheat sheet is,
So it's the
putting
transition
lithium,
metals, it's the heavy metals that make it expensive.
Yeah, cobalt.
And it's cobalt. And the reason why, even though it's interesting, and there's a lot of theories that maybe cobalt doesn't do it, but it worked in the first recipe, so they've kept it. Where you have the LFP, or the lithium iron phosphate, they have the least energy density, but it's the cheapest to make because it doesn't have any of those. Doesn't have.
I mean, look, I would say there are a lot of interesting and esoteric experiments going on in battery technology right now. And my disclaimer is I am not a battery scientist by any stretch of the imagination. And frankly, I don't really concern myself with the day-to-day ups and downs of battery development because it's not germane to the progress that we're trying to make in the real world right today. Like, I'm glad that there are a lot of brilliant people working on that, but that's not the focus of my work.
Sure.
That said, I mean, I have full faith that those people will come up with much better solutions, much cheaper solutions. I mean, they're already doing it, and so I just don't want to be the one that speculates about which of those emerging trends is going to be the ultimate winner.
Yeah.
And being an environmentalist, I'm sure you're here with me. We don't draw the line at environmental cost. There's human cost.
Yeah.
Right? But being in a place like we are, I don't know if we introduced our setting, James, but we're in the clubhouse of an apartment.
Give Group. This is Project Open, part of the Give community.
The founders, the builders here, made a list of what kind of benefits they wanted to create for society, and were surprised by how far into their list they got to go. So we've got affordable housing units, and
it's an all electric building.
All electric.
That's
okay,
actually served.
ambient.
So where we're at the Project Open, it's an all electric building, so there's no gas for heat or cooking or anything. It's all electric, and it's served by 100% renewables from our subscriber solar program. So it's
okay. I'm so glad that you brought that up too. The point being that if we're going to talk about making the world a better place, there's no reason to stop with our primary objective. Let's go deeper. So cobalt does need to be discussed and should be discussed whenever we are talking about batteries and improving battery technology. Yes, it has the advantage of not only being the original material, but having advantages that are so far unreplaceable. Such as holding the ceramic matrix more rigid and stable to recharging that manganese just doesn't. But it's expensive. So there are mines in Republic of Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, that are staffed by children, and they are working in dangerous conditions. Now, contrary, I mean, what I could find in reading about the supply chain of cobalt is that that's not the exclusive supplier. There is a myth that that's the only place it comes from. If you've got a lithium battery, then you have killed a child. Is not a direct equivalency. Thankfully, because I carry a cell phone, so, but,
So I think right now, most of the battery manufacturers are trying, I mean, there's an economic reason in addition to the moral reason, which I think.
And also a security supply reason.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
it's not just economics, it's that you don't want to be dependent on one particular region of the world that may or may not have consistent.
Yeah, so you're seeing most of the battery folks move beyond, trying at least to move beyond cobalt, and it's pretty interesting. Tesla is doing their battery day, September 22nd. I have to confess, I'm kind of really interested in seeing where they're going to announce, because most batteries right now are primarily, there's about 5 manufacturers in the world, and most of them are in Asia. Most of the battery technology is actually developed in the United States, in North America. Actually, Canada and the United States are leading in terms of the technology design, but the actual manufacturing occurs in Asia. So it's kind of interesting, exciting to see Tesla really kind of go into this field, because I think they identified that, okay, they can't survive long term by having been supplied by materials from warlords in Africa and child labor and stuff like that. So they had
And part of the reason that the manufacturing in Asia ties into what you were saying, Debbie, is that part of the reason that the manufacturing is so heavily in Asia is that China has made a strategic effort over decades to try to control the cobalt supply to the greatest extent possible. So those things are directly related.
So I just want to shove in a last little bit to this, which is that a little more than half of cobalt comes from Central Africa, a little less than half comes from China. But not all the cobalt that comes from Central Africa is from artisanal operations. There are large-scale mining operations. So when one hears that a company is making an effort to source their metals responsibly, there is such thing as doing so. And I just wanted to make that clear, that that you can make an effort to buy from the right source.
Yeah. So one of the things that's interesting that what Tesla is, I was mentioning what Tesla's doing, they're going to announce, well, I guess next week, that they're going to start manufacturing battery cells. So they'll be the first manufacturer here in the United States. And it's a different business decision for an auto manufacturer, which to me I find fascinating, where the other automakers have taken a completely different approach, especially going back to the cost thing, where I actually was meeting with an executive from Volkswagen, and he was talking about how, and he honestly was saying, he's like, there is not a single automaker that is going to make one EV more than they have to. He was basically saying EVs are more expensive to make, and we're not going to make one more than the government forces us to make. And it was really fascinating that was the view that, and I think that was kind of the consensus view of all of these OEMs, where they were like, okay, we're going to wait for battery costs to come down before we go into that. Where Tesla's taking a different approach, and I don't think you can have a conversation about EVs unless you really talk about Tesla, since they've really helped create it out. They've taken a different business model approach where they're going to actually go out and drive those costs down. They're not going to wait for the cost to come down. They're going to drive the cost down. And so, and some of that is fascinating. If you listen to some of the interviews from Elon Musk, who's a fascinating, weird person, who is just very entertaining, although he has that interesting South African accent that you're like, what is that? But anyway, he talked about why they brought in-house. So part of their business model is to vertically integrate, where they're gonna own every aspect of the process, and they're gonna do it.
Which is fundamentally different from the way the American auto industry has worked ever since the 1920s. So that's a long-standing, that was an interesting strategic move, contrary to the status quo. Forget electric, right?
Yeah. And what was really just interesting, what they're saying is he was saying the reason why they're doing that also is because they had to. Because as a startup, you go out to a supplier, and he's like, yeah, we get the B team or the C team from a supplier who's primarily supplying Toyota or some other, and so for them to try to innovate, they couldn't work with the suppliers in it. So the only way to achieve the product that they wanted to achieve is they had to bring it in-house.
Yeah.
And there's that steep curve on that, and they call it that chasm to have to cross it, where it's fascinating where the traditional OEMs, they're in that legacy challenge where they're not doing that because they've outsourced all these components. They let someone else do it for cheaper, and then they bring it back together and they assemble and they can, yeah.
Do you mind if we define OEM?
So original equipment manufacturer. So that's like the Fords and the General Motors and the Toyotas and the Hondas.
Yeah.
Right.
So I feel like this is a good place to mention the ZEV policy, right? So you mentioned that historically some of the legacy automakers have been reluctant to produce EVs, and I think that's, I mean, from everything that I've seen, there's been a pretty significant change on that front in the last several years. I think historically that is very true, and without naming names, like there are some automakers who have been leaders and some others who have been much more resistant to adopting, electrified drivetrains. But that said, I think, California deserves a lot of credit for creating the ZEV program, and now I think it's up to 11 states with Colorado joining last year.
Yeah.
It's basically everything that touches water on the Pacific, New England, and Colorado. But so the ZEV stands for Zero Emissions Vehicle. They have basically it requires manufacturers that sell in the state of California to sell a certain percentage. The percentage changes over time, so it gives them predictable. Business wants predictable regulation, right? So it gives a predictable ramp up of a percentage of electric vehicles or zero emissions vehicles. It's not only electric, I should say, that they're required to sell in the state of California. California can do that partly because it has a special history in terms of air quality regulation that is way more than an hour's podcast.
Yeah, the Clean Air Act, yeah.
But also California is, the world's 5th largest economy, and so they have a certain power as a marketplace. But they've allowed these other states to collaborate and sign on to that standard. And the net result has been creating, again, stability for some of those automakers to say, okay, well, by 2015, I have to be producing at least X number of EVs. By 2018, I have to be producing at least X number of EVs. So it gives them a target, and by having these other states sign on, it adds to that target. It creates economy of scale. It helps drive down costs ultimately. And from the consumer's perspective, one of the big benefits is that, in Utah still, there are a lot of compelling EVs that we can't buy here, right? That just are not marketed in the state of Utah. We are not a ZEV state, right? In the ZEV states, basically every electric vehicle that's sold in America is sold in those states. And so that was a big part of Colorado's reasoning for signing on to ZEV. It may not be a perfect system, and I don't think ultimately I think that the market will bypass that requirement.
Well,
but it's a stepping stone, right? And it has given some of those OEMs the certainty that they need in order to produce the vehicles that a lot of us would like to see.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You look at the growth that's happening in EV sales right now. It's primarily happening in Europe and China because it's being driven by policy, regulatory policy. One of the things that's fascinating is interesting with going back to Tesla is because now they have a deal with Fiat in Europe where they're basically providing their EV credits to
similar to the ZEV system.
Yeah, and so they just got a huge payment, a quarter, like $300 million. So what ironically, what helped finance and help pay for Tesla to bridge these cost gaps were the other automakers buying their credits.
It's not exactly analogous, but it's not unlike the idea of carbon credits, where if one person overproduces, then someone who's underproducing can trade, et cetera. So it creates a marketplace for that. I think it's an interesting system, and I think it's something where it does create more consumer choice than exists in most of America today. which is an interesting. I know we'll get to that later, but
So one of the other big things about the battery, and I guess before we kind of wrap up that topic, is the recyclability. Can you recycle, especially because you have these heavy metals that are in the battery, and one of the challenges is, can you recycle these batteries? So
I really wish I had a better answer for that. It seems like, perhaps you are more familiar with recycling, it seems somewhat aspirational.
I think the big challenge is that as I mentioned, there are about 5 different battery cell makers in the world, and they all have unique chemistries.
Yeah.
And so the challenge is you can't take a Nissan Leaf battery chemistry, the Chevy Bolt battery chemistry, and a Tesla they're all
And
different.
throw them all in a pot.
And you can't, yeah.
Right,
So
you
you
got your
have.
organic electrolyte, or your gasoline, basically. I mean, just a little bit of oil for the ions as they migrate, and you got your graphite, you've got your mix of earth metals on the other side,
So,
and then
I mean,
casings.
again, I'm not a battery scientist, right? But fundamentally, yes,
But you
batteries.
did stay at a Holiday Inn.
I've stayed at more than one Holiday Inn. I can tell you that, although not in the last 6 months.
That's right. You're not on the road right
Yeah,
now.
it's weird. But so fundamentally, yeah, batteries are recyclable. There are materials handling complexities, and that probably means that a lot of recycling will need to be done by OEMs, or at least by battery producers. But even before you get to recycling, I mean, I personally have been involved in pilot projects already that involve stationary energy storage using batteries that were taken out of salvage EVs, like say for example, an old Leaf or something that was in an accident, the battery's undamaged, the car's totaled, whatever. Those batteries can be used for stationary storage, and so even what might be considered a spent battery in a vehicle application still has a lot of value to the grid, or to a building owner who wants energy resiliency, for outages like we experienced last week.
Okay, so
And-
you got another 1,000 charges in.
Yeah, the thing is that like what we expect of a battery for a propulsion application
Right.
is intense, right?
Yeah.
We expect it to discharge very quickly, to accelerate. We expect it to charge very quickly, so that we don't have to sit around for 3 hours on a road trip. And those are things that
And we expect it to retain its capacity.
right. And so
It
those
goes
are
to
those
the
are
chemistry, yeah.
those are things that are challenging, right, from a material
With all
standpoint.
of the kinds of degradation that can happen.
So I think, yeah, like yes, batteries can be recycled. I think that there's probably I don't even know how many hundreds of billions of dollars of value in figuring out that whole ecosystem that people are working on.
Right.
But even before you get there, there are a lot of, the grid needs a lot more batteries, right? And-
Yeah, so-
and some of those are gonna come from used EVs.
So a lot of those used
Yeah.
EVs, when it stops reaching the point of
Yeah.
the propulsion, it still has about a 60% capacity in it.
Yeah.
The challenge is how the batteries were designed is they come in these packs, and then there's these modules inside the
Yeah.
packs, and then you have the cells.
So you have to do it from the same manufacturer, right?
Yeah.
Which is why, so this is an interesting development, right? And again, Tesla was a leader in this area because, as you said, they were one of the first movers, and an extremely innovative one. But even beyond Tesla, Tesla has a whole battery division, right, that sells stationary storage products. But beyond that, you've got automakers, including Nissan and BMW and others, that are developing their own business lines. They're becoming energy companies, not just auto companies.
Right.
And it's because, like you said, you can't take, oh, here's a battery from a BMW, and here's a battery from a Nissan, and here's a battery from a Chevy. We're going to smack all those together and put them in a building. Right?
Yeah.
It's an integrated system.
But what
Yeah.
they're not becoming is rare earth metal commodity supply companies. And that's the part about recycling that.
Yes,
is-
but, and I don't want to speak on the
Okay.
details, but
Right.
there are actually, there have been some press releases about auto OEMs in the last year getting into the rare earth metal supply business. And I'll leave it at that because I don't want to misspeak on the details. But
So that's when you have recycling.
yes, no, it is, it really is.
Versus the reusing, which I think is what
Yeah.
we were kind of talking about.
So again, this is why it's exciting to be in a rapidly evolving industry, is that things are changing so much.
Yeah.
But that is something where I think that you point out an absolutely critical problem, and I think that is becoming more appreciated, and at least two that I can think of have made announcements around that.
So, going back to what were the big barriers to EV adoption? You said cost, and we kind of really went into that, which is batteries, and also the redesigning the.
Sorry, James, one more quick thing on cost that we didn't touch on at all, and I think it's an important point. I won't belabor it, but so most of the discussion around EV stuff in general happens at kind of the leading edge, the bleeding edge technology end of the market. The other piece, though, is if we want this to be a broad solution for everybody, there's an equity component, and I think one of the things that will evolve, or is starting to evolve, is a strong used EV market, where vehicles that have suffered a little bit of that initial year or two of depreciation are still
Particularly rentals.
yeah, and are extremely capable vehicles, and are actually more capable. They've got more usable life in them. Most EVs that at 2 or 3 years in coming off of a lease have more usable life in them left than a gas vehicle does.
Well, and that's what's kind of wild too with some of the new advances in batteries. We're talking about a 1,000,000-mile battery.
Yeah, and
that'll
we're not there
really-
yet, but I think that's the vision, right?
Yeah.
And I think, Lyft recently has done, I've seen a couple of presentations from Lyft recently where they're talking about they've announced earlier this summer a very admirable plan to take Lyft 100% electric. And it involves, it's going to rely on partnerships with a lot of other parties. But one of the things that they've been emphasizing is that for a lot of their drivers, having a robust, deep and well-stocked used EV market is going to be a critical thing. You have to get those EVs on the road first.
And one of the other barriers to this, and we actually have been partnering with Lyft and doing a lot of work and have some fantastic data. What we found, so actually what kind of this next transition, which is infrastructure, which is which is a big issue on the equity side as well, but with the charging infrastructure. And so we did, as part of our WestSmart project, we installed fast chargers along I-15 pretty early in the project, and we've been collecting data. And what we found was that, most people don't use fast chargers unless they're going to Vegas or California, unless they're going long distance. Most people in the city that are commuting just use level 2 chargers because they charge at home or at work. So most of the fast chargers aren't going to get used. So which was an interest. So we actually focused our program to be on workplace charging to really help drive to get those commuters. Once we did our project with Lyft, and we looked at some of the interesting aspects of TNC drivers and the needs, where they actually meet with fleets, and so fleets do need fast charging in the urban area, and then also the equity issue. They didn't have access to charging at their apartment complexes or on certain neighborhoods. And so that really brought up the need to, if we really want to push EV adoption, we got to really expand our charging infrastructure, not just put a charging infrastructure for early adopters, which is what we have right now, but to really expand it so we can capture low income and capture fleets.
It's a great realization, because I think there's a big divide in the EV charging in the infrastructure world in terms of access, between people who own single-family homes with their own garage and can make the choice to just go put in a charger if they want to, and people that live in apartments or in rental homes and they don't necessarily have the freedom of choice to make infrastructure decisions. Which is part of why it's incredibly important that that apartment developers like Give include EV infrastructure, as they've done in this building, as part of the amenities of an apartment building, right? That's a huge factor as well. But yeah, there's a real divide in terms of the way that those two populations use public charging infrastructure. And I think the other thing I'd add on the infrastructure side is just, I don't know if you've seen this in some of the surveys you've done recently, but I think there's a big disconnect between sometimes perception and reality of where we've been and where we are now. And I think there are a lot of folks that looked at electric vehicles. People who are interested would like to own one, see themselves in one in the future, but they kind of looked at them in 2015 or 2016 and thought, well, it's not quite ready for me. Like the charging's not quite there. They've become fluent in range anxiety, right? Like they've read articles all about that. And what they don't realize is that a lot of stuff has been built recently. And like when I switched from renewable energy and building technology to the electric vehicle space, there were 2 public DC fast chargers in the state of Utah.
Yeah.
Right? Not stations, chargers, like actual individual chargers. And at present, it's somewhere between 55 and 60 locations, I believe, that are operational. And each of those has anywhere, some of them have 1, some of them have 2, some of them have up to, I think, 8 chargers. And that's public universal standard, by the way. It's if you include Tesla, which is proprietary plugs only serves Tesla drivers. If you include those, it's probably pushing 75 locations. And that's a lot of progress.
So do we, as we're getting close on time here, so as we think about infrastructure, we're entering a new level of adoption and consumer, where before it was focused on early adopters, and those early adopters will adapt and do things. How do we do infrastructure, but then also what are just some of the more consumer preferences that will help drive both the infrastructure but also the vehicle designs as well, which I think is a pretty interesting.
Now, what year would you say was the first, cause looking at 2020 cars and 2019 cars, there are electric vehicles that have the same body as their internal combustion counterparts.
Yeah, for sure.
Right, and so you can drive an electric vehicle, you have to do a double take and to check on the back whether it's an electric vehicle. That didn't used to be the case. It was like the early adopters, if you were in an EV, you wanted it to look like an EV, and vice versa. I mean, you would only buy an EV if you're willing to be singled out.
Well, I think some of that was also because
You would wave at each other.
I think some of that was
early Prius people, right?
Exactly, yeah.
well, I think some of that was because the traditional automakers wanted to still sell trucks and SUVs because they make so much profit on it. They didn't want to design an EV that would take that market away.
So. I mean, the first hybrid sedan that just looked like a sedan, it's like, oh wow, you're not showing off. It's weird.
Yeah.
But like now you've got SUVs that are on the market that are not that. I guess a couple $1,000s can mean something very different to different people, so I won't speak to that. But like the Hyundai, what's it called,
The
Kona. So
right.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, that's available
an
in,
SUV.
I mean, you pick it, right? They've got a gas Kona, they've got a plug-in hybrid Kona, they've got a regular hybrid Kona, and they've got an EV Kona. So it's just, you can choose whichever drivetrain you want.
And
Yeah.
even if you charge up a Kona in the worst spot in the country for electricity profile, generation profile, and high altitude and cold weather, and all the things that can conspire to make your EV less carbon friendly, less efficient, it's still something like 60 miles to the gallon equivalent.
Yeah.
And in a place like here in California, it's up in 100 miles per gallon.
Easily over
equivalent.
100, yeah.
And
I mean,
like in an SUV.
sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say, go ahead and.
Well, so I think, to me, one of the most exciting things that's happening as I look down the road at like 2021, 2022, is that, I think the majority of people who were primarily motivated in their car purchase decision by environmental factors, probably either they're already driving an EV or maybe still a hybrid, but they've already kind of made that choice, right?
Yeah.
And so how do we get from that to a broader audience? And I think, for the last several years, there's been, primarily the market's been driven by, the EV market has been dominated by, basically compact commuter vehicles, which are perfect for certain use cases, but you're never going to convince somebody that's got a large family and fills up a minivan or a Tahoe or something like that. You're never going to get that person to drive a Nissan Leaf, right? And so I think that's been something that everyone's been waiting for, and we're, I think, right on the cusp of that. I mean, we're already there in kind of the luxury end of the market. You've got multiple luxury all-wheel drive SUVs capable of handling Park City mountain roads and things like that in a blizzard, and hauling all your ski gear. They're expensive. They're luxury cars. They're basically the same price as other luxury SUVs, right? So it's that boring. I mean, it's a separate thing. I think what we're seeing in 2021, 2022 is that is coming to the kind of the mid-range of the market, and also pickup trucks. And I mean, personally, I'm incredibly excited about that because pickup trucks are, as we probably all know, one of the dirtier vehicles on the road, and yet we love them, right? They're so capable, and they take us to amazing places. And Utah's a great example of a place where there are a lot of places you can't get unless you have a very capable off-road vehicle.
Okay, Debbie,
Yeah.
the Cybertruck, love it or hate it?
The what truck?
The Cybertruck, Tesla Cybertruck.
Oh,
The design, do you love it or hate it?
yeah, no, it's trying.
So it's interesting. It's kind of going back. It kind of reminded me a little bit of the Apple thing. Like, why would you get a tablet?
Yeah.
And it's that, and I think Steve Jobs used to say, "Well, I'm going to make the product that they don't know that they want it until they see it."
Yes.
And the Cybertruck is one of those things where, at first, when you first look at it, I was like, "Oh, that's kind of weird." But then the more you start, at least for me, the more I started reading about it, it's like, oh, the design. It's an exoskeleton that comes into one thing, so it actually reduces manufacturing costs. So it'll be the cheapest truck that can be made, and then on top of that, it is super strong. So it's basically like a tank.
Yeah.
And then it has the drivetrain, and it's like a sports car.
It's not the only one, right? Like there are electric pickup trucks coming out in that 2021 to 22 range from at least 7 manufacturers that I can think of, and that's they'll serve different niches, right? Some of them will be more for recreation, some of them will be more for work trucks or fleet vehicles, right? But I think that has the potential to do some of what Tesla already did. And part of what made Tesla's play brilliant was that they recognized that by electrifying the vehicle, you could make it just a better vehicle. You could make it do things like a lot of Tesla drivers. What they'll tell you is that their vehicle just knows them. It adapts when they sit down, or when their husband or wife drives the vehicle or something. It adapts to the new driver. It knows all these things. It has nothing to do with the fact that the drivetrain is electric. But when the drivetrain is electric, it allows you to do all these other things that are very interesting and compelling from both from a convenience and also from a function standpoint. And I think similar to that, I mean, my business partner was telling me the other day about a friend of his in Texas who has been a hot rod car guy for a long time, and he was planning to buy a high-end Hemi-powered, I think it was the Dodge Challenger, right, like a muscle car.
Yeah.
And on a whim, a friend had told him to go drive a Model 3, just to see, and he bought the Model 3. And why did he buy the Model 3? He didn't buy the Model 3 because it was electric. He bought it because it had ridiculous acceleration.
Yeah. Well,
Right. He bought it because it had ridiculous acceleration. I think the electric pickup trucks have the potential to have that kind of reaction to people who would have never considered an electric powertrain.
We must see it. I feel.
But when they realize that all of a sudden these electric pickup trucks, they don't have a differential, right? So they don't have 9 or 10 inches of ground clearance like most conventional pickup trucks do today. They have 14, 15 inches of ground clearance. People are going to buy those because they're just better off-road trucks, not because they're electric. And to me, at the end of the day, I don't care why. Right?
Don't you think that we're political wonks sitting in a darkened room in front of cameras talking about what's going to sway voters, when really their mind is getting made up by what their neighbor thinks? I mean, isn't that what or are we really talking about?
I think there's also a generation.
I think
there's a generation.
I think I'm arguing exactly the same thing that you're saying, that what their neighbor thinks, it does matter a lot. And there's going to be a lot of jealousy when the first guy shows up and has 14 inches of clearance and can go over a rock and roll out and his buddy in a gas car can't. All of a sudden that changes minds. And again, it has nothing to do with politics, has nothing to do with the powertrain, has nothing to do with the environment. I think that where EVs are going to win in America is based on just being better vehicles.
Just the performance.
And it's going to be on performance and features. And I think that,
And
You talk
cost.
about out muscling.
yeah,
Out,
yeah.
out lifting,
But-
out
But
rifle
frankly,
posting. And
that's a large part of the success that Teslas have thus far, right? A lot of people don't buy Teslas because of the environmental attributes. They buy them because they're status symbols and because they're high performance cars. And I think a lot of manufacturers have started to realize that. And what we see in the next, 6 to 18 months is going to be reflecting.
So going back to the focus group we did, one of the fascinating things was the generational shift that we saw there, which was, there was a consensus, which was interesting. Everybody believed EVs were coming. The older folks were basically saying, no, I'm never going to buy one. But then the younger people were like, yeah, I'll eventually probably have one. Even though and even though they didn't know anything about EVs, it was just it was fascinating. There's this kind of mindset of like, of course I'm going to have one day because it makes sense. There's an interesting generational change. So Chris, how are we doing on time?
You got another hour.
Uh-oh.
Well, on that note, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful discussion. Debbie, thank you for joining us.
Thank
Really
you so
appreciate
much.
that. David, thank you for joining us.
Good fun.
And I'm James Campbell, Director of Innovation and Sustainability Policy at Rocky Mountain Power. And very happy and appreciate you all watching and listening to our podcast, our Live Electric Now podcast. Please check us out on Friday, September 18th at 3 o'clock. We're going to do our second in our series where we're going to talk about buildings and EVs, and we're going to actually talk to the owner of this building, Chris Parker, and then we're also going to talk to Hanko Kieschner, who's the CEO of PackSize, who's been doing amazing stuff with fleets and EV workplace chargers. So it should be a great conversation. So please join us, and thanks for listening.